All right, so we have a couple maps. I wish our screen were larger, but it is what it is. So let's do what we can to take a look. And I just got new glasses, so these help me a lot. I can hardly see that. So forgive me if you guys can't see much on this one. This will be the most difficult to see, probably. We have three maps we're going to look at. We're going to look at close-up fight against ISIS in Mosul and around Mosul. And then we're going to pan out to see Iraq and Syria. And then we're going to see the wider globe. So this is the Mosul operation on Election Day. So this is about 8 days old. And it's a very busy map, and I won't go through everything, but you can sort of see the Iraqi security forces are the red section, or pink, if you're farther back, and they're encroaching in from the east. That's what we've heard for a while. I think about 2 weeks or so, where things started to get really hairy. And CNN had a correspondent get bogged down and really showed the bloody nature of the fight for Mosul and how it appears to only probably be getting a lot more bloody. The nature of a dug-in insurgency. To the left, you have a little bit of coming up from the western side of Mosul from the south. You have some Iraqi security forces cutting off that line, and what we can't see, which is just off the screen to the left, is Tal Afar, and that's probably the most recent development. Supposedly, the airport had been taken by some of the popular mobilization units, the Shia-led, Shia-dominant forces that are partnering with the Iraqi security forces. So this is just a little bit of a window into how much, this is only Mosul, how complicated and how many different players we have in this fight. Now if we pan out a little bit, and we see Iraq and Syria, this is a bit of a rainbow map, marbleized, some have called it, and black is a bit exaggerated because there's some spaces. I was talking with our panelists prior to kind of get their sense of what we're looking at. The spaces more, I'll kind of hop down real quick, more around here aren't very populated, aren't as populated as more along the rivers with the Euphrates and with the Tigris. But nevertheless, you can see how many different actors we have going on here, and of course a lot of these are simplified. Iraqi security forces, for example, have a lot of different other components involved with that. Panning out to the globe. This is from ISW, and this is their ISIS global attack campaign over the last 12 months. And so here you can see a lot of the bubbles, the orange, the yellow, and the red. The red in particular, those are successful attacks, and the yellow and the orange, those are thwarted attacks. But you can see that they're busy and they're an ambitious group, and they're looking to go much farther than just Iraq and Syria. Right now, the main operation we're going to start with is, or sort of to lay the context, we have Mosul, which is being taken with, generally I'm seeing a lot of numbers in the neighborhood of 100,000 different security forces. Up next might be the Raqqa operation in terms of priority for the U.S. military. Got some people moving in with the Syrian Democratic Forces moving south toward Raqqa. Those are sort of the main two priorities that seem to be taking the U.S. military's attention. One thing that we've heard for months is that Defense Secretary Ash Carter said that President Obama wanted to accelerate the campaign against ISIS. And one of the campaign promises we heard from President-elect Donald Trump is that he wants to end ISIS quickly, and so he wants to as well accelerate in his own way what the U.S. military is doing over there against ISIS. So my question for the panelists here is, and we'll start with Kim, and then we'll go over to X, as he is known. Where would it be wisest to accelerate against ISIS?
Well, ISIS has essentially constructed a global campaign plan, of which the campaign inside of Iraq and Syria is one part. It's obviously a core part, as you have pointed out. But our campaign against ISIS, while focused right now on Iraq and Syria, and particularly on Mosul and Raqqa, is just one element of a strategy needed to counter ISIS in its various manifestations, whether it's elsewhere in the Middle East region, more broadly in what it would call historical caliphate lands, or in the West, or in Asia, where it is operating as well. When we're looking at what's happening inside of Iraq and Syria, Iraq is going somewhat faster than Syria. That is our main effort. We're a little bit out of sequence between operations in Mosul and operations in Raqqa. And the theory, as I understand it, and I'll actually let X explain the theory more, is that simultaneously going after ISIS in Mosul and Raqqa would remove it from its two primary urban areas on which it had formed the caliphate. I think that that was true back in 2014, and I think that those are necessary tasks to undertake, but I don't actually think they're sufficient tasks, even for defeating ISIS in Iraq or Syria. So there are a couple things that I think that we need to do on this inner theater in order to accelerate what's happening. First of all, we need to recognize that there are limits on how fast we can accelerate. The Iraqi security forces are doing the clearing. They are running into what is not unexpectedly really difficult urban terrain in Mosul. We actually have to respect the fact that an urban fight is a hard fight. It could be perhaps done more smoothly and easily were we, the United States, there with all of our capabilities, but that's a hypothesis. It's not the reality. We are moving at the speed of the Iraqi security forces inside of Mosul. What I think could really help them is multifold. First of all, there is still an ISIS threat elsewhere in Iraq, and the Iraqi security forces can't meet all of the threats that they face at once. We're watching ISIS reconstitute in historic places such as Diyala province, to the northeast of Baghdad, as well as out in the Euphrates River Valley. Those are places that could use attention. But the primary location that we at ISW assess is really problematic for ISIS to continue to hold is Deir ez-Zor, which is its hub on the Euphrates River. It is an urban area. It does have some Syrian regime-controlled neighborhoods, but it is fundamentally an ISIS-controlled city. And so we have to stop imagining that once we take Raqqa and Mosul, ISIS will be out of the urban areas in Iraq and Syria. On the contrary, there's a city we're not even talking about that has been giving them some ability to reinforce from theater to theater, where they have established themselves in and among the tribes, where they have a fair bit of oppressive control over urban terrain. And that's an area that the next administration really needs to be thinking about, and the US military needs to be thinking about, because it is a bastion of ISIS.
No, look, first off, and it is a great pleasure to be up here on this panel with Kim, who I've worked with since 2009. I was telling her before we got on this that I was part of some negotiations over the summer, and I needed a good graphic to, present to the other side, who was not a NATO treaty ally. And I told my team, I was like, look, this one's secret rel, this one's secret no foreign. Like, I got to have something that I can use here on the table. And they said, well, this is the one we've been using internal to the team. I said, Institute for the Study of War, are you serious? I mean, we're going to go with a think tank graphic here? And they were like, well, look at it, sir. And I looked at it and I was like, yeah, this is really good. So credit to Kim for just the awesome work that she's done. I think I told her earlier before the panel that I think ISW has really filled a key niche here in the DC policy community, just providing straight balls and strikes military analysis. I think it's been really invaluable. Let me wind back the clock a little bit to May of 2015 when I came into this position. I had previously served in the Department of Defense in my office in the policy shop for the Middle East, left for 2 years, blissfully worked on stuff that had nothing to do with the Middle East and defense policy. I was in the private sector. Came back in. I think it was the week after Ramadi fell, I walked into my Iraq director's office, who's been a friend of mine for like 5 years, and I said, Dan, really? The weekend before I take the job? And speaking of, one of the great unsung heroes of the Iraq War, guys like Dan Folliard, Lee Nolan, my Iraq director and Syria director, respectively, have just done fantastic work. They're the folks that never get to the headlines. You'll never hear their names, but just do phenomenal work. And most of those key personnel are going to stay on through the transition. So just quality folks. I can't complain about the people that I have working for me. Really remarkable. But the bottom line is that the war was not going too well for us in May of 2015. But at the same time, and so I'd go on Capitol Hill and I'd try to explain the war, and it was in some ways I was explaining in theory what wasn't yet happening in practice, and that was a couple things. Again, I'd been outside of the government for 2 years, and so when I came back, when I left, ISIS didn't exist. When I came back, I really tried to take a look at kind of what they were doing well, what they were doing poorly. A couple things that I thought they were doing very, very well, and if you can go back, actually that map's perfect right there, and I'm just going to get up and talk. So one of the things that they were doing exceptionally well was their ability to move across the battle space. And they weren't that great, but what they were good at doing was pressing where they'd see the regime or other opposition groups the weakest. And so we'd see them push into Ramadi in one case, or Tadmur, Palmyra in another case. They were pressing at those areas where they were able to see the regime weakest. And the other thing they had is that this line, it exists on a map, but for them it didn't exist. And they were very good at using kind of the natural lines of communication, or unnatural, like the Highway 10 in this case, going from Raqqa to Mosul, flexing their forces across the battle space. So we tried to do two things starting in kind of the summer of 2015. And that was, first off, squeezing them from multiple directions and creating dilemmas for them across the battle space. So not only pushing on them in vicinity of, let's say, Fallujah, but pushing from the north, from the east, bolstering our key Jordanian and Lebanese partners to the south and southwest. And then the second thing we began to do was start trying to cut off those key lines of communication and supply. So for example, over the past 18 months, as we've seized places like Shadadi, we've taken away their ability to move freely across the battle space in northern Syria and northern Iraq. And so I think that what we've tried to do is that kind of bring simultaneity into the campaign. And so I just want to frame this in terms of what you're seeing today. There is a reason why we're trying to execute Raqqa and Mosul, not simultaneously, but in tandem with one another. And the reason is to create those dilemmas for them across the battle space. I don't think any of us are under the illusion that the fight ends when we seize those two, or when our the local forces with whom we've partnered seize those two cities. But what that is happening is we've seen a pattern, and we've seen this in Manbij, we've seen it in Shadadi, we've seen it in Fallujah. As we begin to encircle Daesh, they will begin to leave the objective and kind of put up stiff resistance, but will eventually try to get out with whatever families and foreign fighters they're able to do so. The bottom line is that Kim's exactly right to focus on Deir ez-Zor, but there are not many places for them to go beyond that. And getting there from Raqqa is one thing, but getting there from Mosul is quite difficult. So I think that they are running out of terrain. We've taken about 50% of their populated territory in Iraq back, taken about 25% of the populated territory they once controlled in Syria back. They're simply running out of real estate in both Iraq and Syria. And I take your point. We're not going to defeat. Secretary Carter likes to talk about the parent tumor. In terms of ISIS, we're going to defeat the second IS. What manifestations the Islamic State takes, both in the metastases, as Secretary Carter puts it, or in terms of the foreign fighter networks, I think remains to be seen. Both the chairman and Secretary Carter have used the exact words that Kim just used. seizing Mosul and Raqqa is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We certainly realize that, and so I think when we think about what the next steps are, is to go ahead and collapse on that the rest of that parent tumor, while at the same time paying close attention to the metastases and what changes you'll see going beyond that. Ben.
Okay, thanks. As we're kind of doing a broad view of what could be accelerated, what might lie ahead, is there something, a key point or anything that either of you think the public maybe underappreciates about what lies ahead in this fight against ISIS?
Well, I'm not sure that I can speak for the public.
Is there one that would benefit?
But let me say a few things, because I think X has framed the framework correctly here. I mean, he's talked about some real changes that we're watching in Iraq and in Syria. But there's also an assumption that's in there that's really important to tease out, which is that ISIS has nowhere else to go but Iraq and nowhere else to go in Syria. And what we're starting to see is an adaptation of ISIS.
Right.
It's not even a metastasization.
You're talking about the shift back to terrorism.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but what we're watching is ISIS is a shape-shifting organization. It's a hybrid war-fighting organization. It can go from higher-end combat arms all the way to terrorism, to assassinations, to just information operations. And it deliberately shifts based on the environment it's in and the threat and pressure it's under. It can also geographically shift. And what we are seeing is some ISIS pop up in Western Syria, where the United States is not present. And we're also seeing some little shoots, little nodes forming around what had been nodes, but I think they're becoming more active in what we call the regional power centers in the Middle East, the neighbors of Iraq and Syria. In particular, Turkey. We're seeing it likewise in Egypt. We're quite worried about it in Jordan, and we've seen a blip in Saudi Arabia, but where it's a smaller blip. The point is that ISIS has a strategy for weak states and for strong states. And ISIS is working on making sure that it can relocate itself in the neighboring states, particularly those that have, in their mind, a government, a form of government that is insufficiently Muslim, and where they can actually go ahead and continue to pursue their objectives. So eroding Turkey, eroding Saudi Arabia to strong states, eroding Jordan, a weaker state, are some of the things that it's undertaking. And so I think we really have to be careful not to say that ISIS is going to be gone out of the theater. I think ISIS is still there in the theater, and it's conducting itself differently and breaking itself up into different nodes throughout the region. We need to watch whether capabilities actually go to those nodes, not just people.
No, I think that's so right. I just quick response, because I think what Kim's laid out is exactly where we should be focused. I will note that as they move into other territory, whether it's southwestern Syria or whether it's Jordan or Turkey, they move into more difficult terrain. First off, they're moving. And as they're moving, they present a easier target for some of our competitive advantages, namely our air power, our ability to utilize special operations forces to do interdictions. But they also, as they move into Turkey, Turkey does not have the weak state problems that Iraq does. We've had to build up Iraq or rebuild up Iraq's security forces over the past 2 years. Turkey has quite effective security forces, and so they're moving into more difficult terrain. That also plays to our advantage. I think the two things that I'd put on people's radar is, first off, the amount of training and equipping that we have done in this campaign is truly staggering. Over the past 24 months, we've trained 25,000 Iraqi security forces, 8,500 counterterrorism service forces in Iraq, 12,000 Peshmerga, 6,000 federal police. After the campaign for Mosul, and after Mosul is taken, can we go to the Mosel map real quick?
Certainly.
So I think one thing that I'd want to put on your radar is you'll see, and I'll jump down again. One thing you'll see is where there's been a lot of progress has been along this eastern axis, where you've seen the CTS be especially prominent. As they've done that, and they have fought like absolute lions, but they have paid a heavy price. And so we're still going to have to maintain our training relationships with groups like the CTS after Mosul, especially if the problem takes a different form. And if it moves into, right now the CTS is being used essentially as shock troop light infantry, but they're originally trained for special operations. And so the CT in CTS stands for counterterrorism. And so as they move back into that problem set, they'll need to be reconstituted, retrained, re-equipped. And as anybody who has any experience in recruiting, training, equipping special operations forces, it just takes time and it takes effort. So I think that's the first thing that I just want to put on people's radars. I think that the training and equipping is going to last long beyond Mosul and Raqqa. The second thing that I want to put on people's radar is that we are doing this all with a 67-nation coalition. In terms of folks that have participated in strikes in Iraq, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Jordan, Netherlands, UK. In Syria, Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Denmark, France, Jordan, Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE, UK. As we move past the ISIS to the just ICE, just the Islamic State elsewhere, how are we going to keep the coalition focused on that problem as it evolves? As it evolves both within Syria and Iraq, but also as it moves outside of Syria and Iraq. And I think that's going to be a task for the next president, to maintain that very effective coalition that we've been able to build, and where we focused on the problems of Syria and Iraq, but we'll want to maintain going forward. That's it.
You do bring up a great point in terms of the spread and the growth and sort of how these things will unfold in the coming months. It does remind me of what we spoke about prior to ISIS's own media agency claims some 20 nations to have some kind of presence inside. And Kim's ISW, I think the number is a different framing, but the number was much higher.
Yeah, we counted this morning, and boy, am I glad we did. We assess that there is coordinated ISIS activity, and that's coordinated in a technical military sense, in 35 countries, of which 11 countries host active wilayats or provinces of the Islamic State, and the others either have what we would assess are proto-provinces, places where pledges have gone out but have not yet been accepted by ISIS center, or they are in the West or in a broader frame. That's where we count. I hope we count differently than Amak. That would make me feel so much better. And I'm sure we count differently from X and his team. But I think it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the human network. Not necessarily the magnitude of the capabilities of that network all over the place. Now, one of the things I think we are seeing that really jumped out to me when my team showed me the global campaign map about a week ago is that we are having, as long predicted, a bit of a diaspora of foreign fighters from Iraq and Syria, either going out to their home countries or being rerouted from Iraq and Syria to other places. And the second thing I think the public should know and be aware of is that we're starting to see nodes forming in some different places in the world where it looks as though there are ISIS fighters or recruits congregating, and perhaps proto-structures from ISIS external operations. And I would just point out that Southeast Asia has a lot more dots on it right now than it did a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, so again, within my writ at the Department of Defense, I've only got the Middle East. That's enough for me. But I think we probably agree on the number. Where where it then becomes important is what, how do you weight that? And that's what, Kim got to that. Not all capabilities are the same. And if, somebody declares, the Viliat Franca or something, I'm not sure the French are exactly quaking in their boots and think the Islamic State's going to take over tomorrow. Different states have different institutions that are stronger or weaker, and so I think we're more or less worried about different states depending on where you see the conditions approaching that it will allow them to actually have territory and provide a base for external operations. That's why I think places like where we've been focused, I think we worry more about places like Yemen or Afghanistan, where you don't have strong government and resilient institutions. Probably less worried about some of our NATO treaty partners, but they've got real concerns as well, and especially on the 1-year anniversary of the Paris attacks.
Well, you remind me with this diaspora dynamic and the foreign fighters maybe not able to get to Iraq and Syria. It reminds me of ISIS leader Baghdadi's recorded message saying one of the points, if you can't make it to Iraq and Syria, party in Libya. And so it does it does raise the consideration as we're talking. You mentioned Yemen, you mentioned Afghanistan. My question for the two of you here, how does the U.S. assume a more assertive posture in the region to combat this consideration that we just discussed? Maybe how would be wise to, or what are your thoughts on should the U.S. be more assertive? If so, how?
Well, I think it's important first to focus on objectives, and then we can talk about being assertive within the context of those objectives. And I know
those
that's
are not terribly clear.
That's a truism, but sometimes I find it helps to say the truisms. In the formulation of strategy and the execution of strategy, you need to have an objective. And I think the reason if I could unpack the request for being more aggressive, I think what some are concerned about is, first, this is taking a long time. Mm-hmm. I would say, well, okay, this is actually a generational fight, so get ready. This is not something that is just going to wrap up neatly as it did in the past. But the second reason why people are talking about being more assertive in the region, I think, is that our allies are not necessarily feeling reassured by some of what we do, although we do have a coalition operating in Iraq and Syria. And our objectives are rather narrowly focused on ISIS, whereas a lot of our allies, although they certainly consider ISIS an important element of their strategy, have other objectives within the Middle East region that they would probably even rank higher than defeating ISIS. And therefore, if our strategy is to be successful, not only against ISIS, but vis-a-vis our allies and our other enemies, we need to broaden our aperture and make sure that we are pursuing, as the United States, a clear set of objectives to reassure our friends and allies, and to make clear to our enemies, other than ISIS, what it is that they can and cannot do. And there are other enemies out there. So if we actually think of ISIS as a component even of one objective of, at the grand strategic level, protecting the United States homeland and our way of life, which then requires actions taken against the Islamic State within Iraq and Syria. We would also notice a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda that is quite active in this region, and that has different relationship to some of our coalition states than does ISIS. Let me pause there.
Yeah, I'll just make 2 quick points. First off, and I think much to the frustration of others, we have taken a buy with and through approach to this, and we are working by with and through our local partners on the ground in both Iraq and Syria. As Kim alluded to, that's got real trade-offs. Had you put, a Marine Expeditionary Unit on the ground and told them to seize Raqqa, they would have seized Raqqa by now. The way we're doing this through local forces takes more time. But Kim and I got to know each other in Afghanistan many years ago when we were fighting a counterinsurgency campaign on behalf of a host nation government. And we can do that, and we've proved in both Iraq and Afghanistan that we can kill the enemy and we can create the conditions for a peaceful political settlement or for whatever political reform needs to happen. But unless you get buy-in from the host nation, unless you get buy-in from the local forces on the ground, then you're not going to necessarily create something that's sustainable. So the theory of the case in terms of the way in which we've approached the Islamic State is we're going to accept some risk in terms of the amount of time it's going to take to get to Mosul, to get to Raqqa. And the risk we're going to assume, we believe, is more than outweighed by the sustainability that we will realize by doing this by, with, and through partners on the ground. The second thing I want to point out, and you put this very politely, but speaking in general terms, if you look at Syria and Iraq, and now I put on my pointy-headed academic hat again. If you look at Syria and Iraq, you look at them as civil wars in which, and like every civil war, all parties to the conflict are fighting with an eye towards their post-war settlement. So even though Daesh may be the enemy of today, each party in Iraq and in Syria is thinking through, how am I setting myself up for post-Daesh Iraq or for post-Daesh Syria? And so at the same time in which we have had a lot of on-the-ground tactical successes against both Daesh in Syria and Iraq, we are navigating some very tricky a very tricky political environment, and it's in large part because of the dynamic that Kim just described.
So there are a couple risks that I would highlight, because I think, look, it's important to recognize why the strategy was chosen, why the approach was chosen, what are the associated risks. That's what military advice consists of, and that's in part how you have to weigh it. So we are watching some of that tension emerge right now in and around Raqqa, where there are Kurdish forces, some of whom the coalition supports, and Turkish-backed forces and Turkish forces in close proximity. Guess what? They don't like each other. They have different end states in mind for what Syria would look like post-conflict, if it makes it to post-conflict, and so that's slowing our operations in Raqqa. As we take a look at Syria and Iraq broadly, one of the trends that we are tracking at ISW is that Al-Qaeda, and in particular its affiliate in Syria, which has a new name, but it's still, let's call it the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, is shifting assets around to backfill the space that ISIS is coming out of. And we saw a call from Al-Qaeda senior leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, actually I don't remember how long ago it was, fairly recently, encouraging essentially Al-Qaeda to reassert itself inside of Iraq. And so that is a factor that I think we need to worry about. And it is complicating dynamics on the ground in Syria, certainly. So I just wanted to give you two very different examples of how those visions of post-ISIS end state are influencing our ability to operate, as well as other actors' ability to operate in the theater.
Yeah, you do bring up a great point with that, which leads into my next question in terms of the overall conditions that gave rise to ISIS. We can have drone strikes and knock out senior leaders and number twos until the cows come home, but when and how might be the best consideration for that those conditions that gave rise to ISIS that as we know it, as opposed to AQI or other iterations.
Right? Good luck.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yours?
Right.
Yours.
I'll take this one. You've covered for me admirably and have taken the first response to all the questions, which has allowed me to write down my. No, I mean I think you get to part of the reason why we fought this. I mean I think in the way that we have, I alluded to working by, with, and through. That's in part, we've also got our eye on post-war governance and the need to build institutions at every level that are going to broker, a more peaceful resolution at the end. I think one of the things that I just point this out because I think it's been a real diplomatic triumph that has gone unnoticed, but has had a real effect at the tactical level, is the cooperation between Kurdish forces and Iraqi security forces has been unimaginably good. That has started at the top down between the work between President Barzani and Prime Minister Abadi. But when I was with the Secretary in Erbil 3 weeks ago, we saw Iraqi attack helicopters taken off out of Erbil. I mean, hit the rewind button back to the 1990s, and if you could have thought of, Iraqi army helicopters taken off from Kurdish territory. We've seen Iraqi security forces passing through Peshmerga lines. We've seen Pesh and Iraqi soldiers side by side in gurneys together in hospitals. We've seen Iraqi security forces providing support by fire for Pesh. And so I want to give a real credit to our diplomats on the ground in Baghdad as well as here in Washington and the way in which they brokered that really important collaboration, which I think has been important. Again, had we been doing this ourselves, I'm not sure we would see that type of collaboration. But those relationships are going to be as important, if not more important, for post-conflict Iraq as they are for the fight for Mosul.
So as we look at those underlying conditions that gave rise to ISIS, we flash back, particularly those of you who've served in uniform, flashback to earlier episodes in Iraq, from which we can draw some lessons, but not universal lessons. In 2014. In 2013, as we at ISW were tracking the rise of ISIS, we had some interesting looks. And back in October of 2013, Jessica Lewis McFate over at our organization forecasted that ISIS's next big target was Mosul. She was wrong. ISIS's next big target was Fallujah, and Mosul was the target after that. But she was right, because their ultimate objective was to capture Mosul. So went back and started looking at what state was Mosul in when the U.S. forces drew down from U.S. forces Iraq presence. And I went back to our command assessments, and we were assessing from Baghdad that there were about perhaps 3,000 Al-Qaeda in Iraq or in high-end insurgents left in Mosul back in 2011. And I point that out because in some ways, I don't want us to define success as going back to 2011. Because 2011 was not successful. 2011 was a petri dish for the regrowth of ISIS. And the reason why it was a petri dish was not only that there were leftover elements, but because the political accommodations were not properly made in Mosul and Iraq as a whole. We could run through the litany of those, but Sunni disenfranchisement and exclusion from government high office, except on terms extremely favorable to Maliki, was certainly one of them. Sunni disenfranchisement with Sunni politicians was a huge factor and really important to a nationwide protest movement that occurred in 2013 that nobody remembers about. There were institutions of the Iraqi security forces were increasingly co-opted by the predecessors
That's right.
of the popular mobilization units, the Iranian Shia-backed militias at that time. Those conditions are still present. So the good thing is we have constructed a force that is capable of conducting this operation. The bad thing is that we do, I mean, I don't know if it's a bad thing, but we do need to sustain it beyond that. And there are the same risks in both the political environment and in the institutional environment that caused the collapse of the security forces and the rise of the Sunni insurgency and ultimately ISIS back in 13 and 14. So that's not good enough. We actually have to keep going well beyond that.
Well, thank you all for that. I meant to give you all a little bit more time for questions. We have about 10 minutes. So if anybody has any questions for our panelists, we'll go, I'm just going to go left to right. So we'll start with, do we have a microphone? Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Andrew Hanna. I'm with Politico. So you touched at the very end on this idea that it's really a political settlement that's going to guarantee the long-term stability of Iraq. And you have, these, like Maliki's not gone, he's still leading a faction in the parliament. And you have the Kurds, wanting to push this as far as they can possibly take it in terms of securing autonomy and potentially federalism. So what role can the United States play on both a diplomatic and military level after the operations in Mosul are done? Like, what specifically can we do, in your opinion? And what would help shepherd the process along? And do we have the capability to act this subtly now in the next administration even?
Who's happy to?
Yeah, let me just focus on two levers that I think we've got, and that I think get to the core of the U.S. value proposition for the Iraqis going forward. The first is, and I think all parties on the ground recognize this, that the things we can do to support the Iraqi security forces, not just in the near fight, but in terms of long-term capability development, are unmatched. And so the relationships that we can build within the Iraqi national security establishment, from the lowest tactical level, in the CTS, on up to the work we do within the Ministry of Defense, I think no one else can match, frankly. The second thing is diplomatic, and one of the things that I think has been important over the past, especially over the past year, has been the degree to which Iraq and its neighbors have had a little bit of a rapprochement, and the willingness of some of Iraq's prominent Sunni neighbors to play a bigger role in Iraq. I think the degree to which we can facilitate Iraq's diplomatic relations with its neighbors in the Gulf, in Turkey, is extremely important in terms of protecting what will no doubt be a very fragile peace for all the reasons that Kim lays out, and for the fact that we expect the threat from son of Daesh, even if it manifests itself in a more terroristic way, we expect that threat will no doubt continue for the Iraqis going forward.
Another thing I would just put on that list is Iraqi elections. We're focused here very much on the military side of things, but the next great contest brewing in Iraq it is the power struggle for office, both among the Shia and as they fight between and among themselves, and then among the Sunni and among the Kurds, and then free for all around. And we had provincial elections that were scheduled for the spring that looked like they may be delayed, and rolled into what will then become a winner-take-all set of provincial and national elections a year from April. On the one hand, we need to make sure those elections happen, but we actually need to use our leverage to make sure that they're free, fair, and that conditions are set in which they are not just free and fair on the surface, but in which we have sufficient community reconciliation, resettlement, and rebuilding for those elections to have meaning and diffuse rather than accelerate grievances of the populations.
It's really important.
Good. All right, so we only have a little bit of time left, so who thinks they have the best question?
Mike.
I'm gonna go first with you, since you do have the tallest hand there, right there, Norm. Go ahead.
Don't ever call him the tallest.
Hey, I'm short. I'm sorry. Forgive me. It's a different world.
Hi, Toby Harshaw from Bloomberg View. You guys made a great case that even after we drive ISIS out of Raqqa and the other cities, that they have lots of territory to fall back on. The incoming administration has talked about having a quick plan to take ISIS out, which ostensibly means that they would take Raqqa and then we would pull everyone back. And then leave everything to the Russians, the Iranians, and the Assad government. So we've still got remnants of ISIS waiting. We've still got Nusra and all of that. What do you guys see in terms of the Russians, the Iranians, et cetera, taking out those remaining terrorist groups? Or is this just going to be another frozen conflict that continues to haunt us forever?
I think that might be easier for me to take on, so let me take this hot
You're
potato.
a good woman, thank you.
Look, ISW has assessed that the cooperation between Russia, the Syrian regime, and Iran inside of Syria is actually driving insurgency, and in fact is driving the Sunni opposition toward extremism. That's in part through the deliberate targeting that Russia has conducted via its air campaign against moderate opposition, I don't want to say moderate and acceptable opposition forces, less extreme forces. And then it's also because that targeting is confirming not just the narrative, but the reality that a lot of Syrian Sunni on the ground feel, namely that they have no friends to come and save them, and that the only people that they can rely on are armed people right around them, and people with the best arms may be the most extreme groups, and therefore we're seeing some consolidation of opposition groups under that more radical fringe, under Al-Qaeda and under organizations such as Ahrar al-Sham. That's really dangerous. And we cannot imagine that Assad and Russia and the Iranians can defeat the insurgency inside of Syria. They cannot control that terrain again, because the fight is so existential that they will not succeed. They will make more insurgents, and they will make a more extreme insurgency. Right now, frankly, I think this plays into the hands of the Russians and the Assad regime, which I think would like to say, hey, United States, look, there are only extremists left. If you want to fight extremists, come along, fight with us. I think we absolutely have to resist that temptation, particularly in Syria, because we will get more extremists. And we game this out. There was no scenario that we could see at ISW in our scenario testing in which Assad, Russia, and Iran could re-secure the country in any short time with any of the capabilities that they had. In fact, in our gaming, we found that they would need more capabilities than they have altogether in order actually to retake that terrain. So it's sort of a fantasy option to rely on the Russians, Iranians, and the regime, and I think we need not to buy into the fantasy.
Thanks for confirming our very, very worst scenario.
That's what we do.
I actually, first off, I don't think you said that much that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying myself, Matt. I think, I'd just make 2 quick points in response to what Kim said, although I do appreciate you jumping on that grenade for me. I think the first is, this president wanted to get the Islamic State in a box for the next administration, and did not want to hand over a resurgent Islamic State, an Islamic State that was going to be still capable of controlling large amounts of territory, and we have clearly put the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria on the pathway towards defeat. So we will hand off that campaign over the next 60 to 90 days to the incoming Trump administration, and we look forward to doing that. And from a Department of Defense perspective, Secretary Carter has been clear that we will do that in the most responsible and professional manner, and in the way and with our usual Department of Defense excellence. So we are looking forward to that passing off that campaign, because we think we've done a lot of good over the past 24 months. The second thing is Secretary Carter has been immensely clear. When Russia went into Syria last September and said it wanted to get after the Islamic State and Nusra, we said that's great. But I think what we've seen in terms of the behavior, and not the rhetoric, what we've seen in terms of the behavior is that hasn't been where the focus has been. That hasn't been, the focus has been much more on going after the immediate threats to the regime, shoring up the Assad regime, not getting after the Islamic State, not getting after what we call core Nusra, where we have been focused. We have been taking strikes against Nusra senior leadership and external operators. That has been a focus of ours. If that's where Russia wants to focus, fantastic, but that's just not what we've seen over the past 15 months. It remains to be seen whether that behavior changes over the course of the next few months.
And with that does wrap up our time. So I thank you all for coming again, and can we give our panelists one more round of applause?